In the world of design, few leaders have walked the path Stephen Gates has. From pioneering projects at Apple to reimagining creativity at InVision, Stephen's journey is one of courage, authenticity, and relentless innovation. Today, he takes us deep into the art of leadership and the fight against mediocrity. This episode isn't just a conversation, it's a blueprint for change. Enjoy.
Stephen Gates, welcome to the Beyond the Interface podcast show. Really happy to have you with us today. Welcome to the show.
Well, no, thanks so much for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, no, it's really good to have you on. You know, you're the host of the Crazy One podcast, international design thought leader. You've got over 20 years experience in design. You've got your own creative studio, local legend. So there's a lot of topics we want to dive into today, but I guess it's probably good to start from the beginning, right, Stephen? So can you tell us a bit about, your career journey and how it's kind of moved along over the years?
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to give it the shortest version I can at this point. I always laugh when people say stuff like that because, like, met me, I'm not that cool. So yeah, I literally, like people say, but I've literally been a designer my entire life. My dad had an ad agency. My mom was an artist. I learned typography starting when I was 2 years old on this like cast iron letterpress that used to sit in my parents' basement. So I used to work with my dad and like we would publish my own storybooks. I started working at his agency when I was 12. So I've worked through advertising for like a long time, then went in-house at places like started hotels and Citibank and InVision and other places like that. And then probably about 3 years ago now, 2.5 years ago now, started my own design studio. So, I've worked on tons of different brands from, one that changed my life was like American Airlines was my client on September 11th to, I was one of the first designers to work on the Apple Watch, like before it was released. And so, yeah, it's just a lot of stuff like that. And right now, just having way too much fun kind of doing my own thing.
Nice.
What would you say is your favorite phase so far? Like, because that's quite an extensive like portfolio, right? Like from kind of airlines, like through to kind of Apple. What's Stephen's favorite phase?
Oh, so I was like asking, like, where do you want to go on vacation? It's like, what are you in the mood for? I mean, look, I think all the work with Apple over the years, I think my work has ended up in like 10 keynotes and stuff like that. I think, being a part of something like the watch before it was released was an incredible once in a lifetime opportunity. I think being able to build brands like help, like working with American Airlines on September 12th to be able to, because that was a company that was on the edge of bankruptcy already. It's like I said, I think those are always the ones where you get to solve really cool problems, but I think it's also there are small brands and things like that as well, because I think, it's kind of like picking your favorite kid. It's hard to say which one. I think, most people will gravitate towards American or the Apple stuff just because the stages were bigger that it was on. But, my honest answer to that is my favorite out of all of that are the people that I went on the journey with, the designers I've been able to help, the careers I've been able to shape, right? I think in a weird way, the stuff that I'm probably the most proud of is the stuff that doesn't show up in my portfolio. And that it was the teams, the people, the careers that let that work be possible.
Yeah, I see what you mean there, Stephen, right? It's like, it's almost like one role was enhanced by the other, right? As you've gone along the years as well, like the learnings you've taken from each role, I'm assuming, right, have made the next one even better, right? And the people you've met.
Yeah, well, the work is the outcome, right? It's the end of the road, or it's a stop along the journey. And again, I think for me, it's a lot of the problems we had to solve along the way. It was the people you got to do it with. It was that sort of the visual representation. And I think this is, like, for me, design is an output and an outcome, right? I think most people look at the output of like, what is the visual thing that came out of it? But for me, it's also the outcome of the creativity, the problems that got solved, the trust that you needed from leadership and other people, right? Like there's a lot that has to go into it for that outcome or for that output to be possible.
Yeah, I love that point there, Stephen, on the outcomes. And, would you say that in your career, there's been a specific outcome that you've kind of looked at and said, yeah, this was where I made it, right? This was like the best kind of outcome I've ever had in a role. I know you said it's like your children, but there's got to be one that you love a little bit more than the others.
Yeah, again, like I said, I think that what we were able to do working on Apple Watch to be able to, so for those who might not remember, I think, we were one of the two main apps that was featured with Starwood and Nike were the two big launch apps. We had done one where you could actually open your hotel door and check in and do a lot of other things through the watch. So again, that got one of the biggest ones that was sort of featured. And so I think getting to work on that platform, getting to reshape an entire industry that I would argue even until now, hospitality still hasn't really seen many innovations like outside of what we were able to do there. But I think, it's like we had to work in secret for 6 months. I think my wife thought I was like going to get a divorce. My team thought I was going to quit. Everybody else thought I was in rehab or something. I don't know, because you just like disappear. And, then all of a sudden one day on Instagram, you take a photo of the Apple badge and everybody knows where you've been. But again, I think those are the ones for me where it's been able to help people. And I think when you look at the impact of the watch or things like that, that's the stuff for me that I'm probably the most proud of.
Nice. And yeah, Stephen, I guess, you've been a leader over these years, right? That's probably been where most of your experience has been in the last few years, leading some of these companies. Do you think the role of leadership has evolved over the years as you've kind of worked throughout these different companies that you've been in?
No, it has. And I think, there's always sort of a natural pendulum that will swing back and forth, where there are times whenever everything becomes very design driven, and then there are times when everything becomes very business driven. I think right now we're in a moment where it's sort of swinging away from design a little bit. But I think leadership, especially in-house leadership, is just tough for so many reasons. I think one is that creativity and corporate culture just don't like to get along. That I think, corporate culture likes certainty and big fives and outcomes, and a lot around creativity is getting things wrong and learning. And so I think that there's a conflict there that can make it difficult. I think that, kind of the modern design leader I'll often describe as somebody that's really good at like executive hysteria management, of just some leader with 3 letters behind their name said something and everybody starts running around and doing it. And I think oftentimes design has to be the one that's like, hold on, can we think about why we want to do this? And I also think for me, what I found is the one thing I think that doesn't get talked about very much is that leaders suffer from imposter syndrome probably worse than anybody else. Because, you're in a leadership role. The problem that most people don't, I think, necessarily identify with is what gets you to the point of being a leader tends to be executional. Whenever you become a leader, it's much more psychological. So in many cases, people may or may not. So a lot of companies do leadership by happenstance of like, let's just try people to see. But I think, that's the problem is then when you get into leadership, your bosses want answers or they want results. Your team is looking for leadership. You're probably not networking the way that you used to because now you have the big job. That, again, you're doing things that's not your core skill set. Like, at least for me, I went to art school so that I didn't have to do budgets and HR things and hiring, right? I went to be a designer. So you're often doing things that are not your core competency. And so I think it can be an incredibly rewarding whenever it works. But I also think, it's incredibly challenging for so many people. And I think especially lately, just not understanding which way the market is going, that it's tough. And I think honestly, that's one of the reasons why I kind of said, look, I'm going to go do my own thing, was just because it can be a grind.
You've mentored over like 200 designers, I believe, right? And
Yeah.
I'm sure some of them are on the cusp of becoming leaders or going through that leadership and transition. And what you just described sounds, well, I'm guessing like to most would kind of sound pretty kind of like intense and overwhelming, right? Because I sometimes think of leadership, especially design leadership, being one of the toughest jobs within the organization because you're getting pulled in so many different directions. You're almost like being hung, drawn, and quartered. You've got your team pulling you one way, you've got their customer pulling you another, the CEO pulling you another, and then you have your direct manager or boss pulling you in another direction. And you just don't know a way to go. I suppose like what I'm asking now is, what would be your advice to someone trying to navigate all of that, for the first time? As you mentioned, a lot of people start
Yeah.
off as being great ICs and we just get dropped into this. How would you advise someone to be successful?
So it's a really good question, and I think it's one that I get asked a ton of times because, like, at some point I'm kind of like, I need to examine my mental health because, like, for me, nobody hires me because things are going well, right? Like, people hire me because your brand is broken, your company is not performing, and you have to be a little wrong in the head just to be like, no, the last 5 people have failed, but I'll be different. So there's a little bit of like ego, there's a little bit of just delusion. I don't know what it is, right? But I think, Jay, the number one thing that I tell people is I think so many leaders get caught up thinking that they need to have all the answers. And for me, in a lot of ways, what I think a lot of leaders don't think about is that fundamentally what you're dealing with really is a design problem. In that you need to now design an organization or design a career path so that you have a lot of the skills to be able to think about it. And so often what I'll try to tell them is like, look, the biggest thing that you often need is you need a plan, not the answer. Because whenever you go into solving a design challenge, you go in to say, I'm going to go look at this, I'm going to explore this, I'm going to try this, and then I'm going to see how it goes and find things along the way. I think the best advice I ever got around leadership was that my mentor had always told me, like, somebody who's a leader is somebody who just has the ability to be the most confident, uncertain person. Right? That it doesn't mean that you necessarily have all the answers, but you can stand up and say, look, we're going this way. So I think one for me is, I think that's what people are looking for. Because in my experience, what your team wants is basically 2 things. They want to know that the work they do tomorrow is going to be better than the work they do today. And whenever it hits the fan, that you'll actually be there to support them, right? I think if you can fundamentally do those 2 things, you can definitely start a team in a good direction. But again, I think so many leaders feel like they have to have all the answers all the time and do a lot of those things, which just puts you in a difficult position. So I think, my approach has always been the direction of the team is clear. What we want to accomplish is clear, but that does not let me off the hook from being human, from being vulnerable, from struggling. I think, like, honestly, even for my own personal brand and me as a leader, I've spent the last few years honestly trying to destroy what people think of me. Because, everybody always wants to ask about Apple and a lot of that stuff, but in a lot of ways, I think it's a very toxic construct to think that I've made it. Right? Or that there's some place where you've accomplished something where you aren't subjected to all these problems, right? It's 100% not true. But I think that's the biggest piece of advice for me around that young leaders is like, look, just start with a plan, right? Like, talk to people, ask for support. Don't try to pretend like you're something you're not, because I think that's where most people get in trouble, is this idea that, like, I have to be this. It's like movies have ruined us, right? You're not Steve Jobs. You're not Elon Musk. You're not going to do it by yourself. You don't have to be perfect. And I think that's where I try to remind a lot of people when I look at my own career, one of my biggest learnings is, like, success is something that only exists in the past, right? I have not, like, the number of times I've built a brand or worked on something that everybody afterwards said, oh, that was so innovative. That was so amazing. Going through it, I thought I was going to get fired. People didn't understand it. Right? Like, after it works, then everybody knew all along. But this idea that, like, they're going to celebrate you as you do it is unrealistic. So I think those are often a lot of the themes for me, like, when you're getting into leadership, is just sort of understand that. Because I think if you can go into it with that construct, then you can deal with a lot of that stress and being pulled in all those different directions.
Yeah. And you mentioned something there, Stephen, about wanting to kind of break down the past of where you worked,
Yeah.
not letting that define you. And I think it's an interesting topic because I definitely noticed that a lot of new people that join an organization, right? It's like they always kind of start with, oh yeah, I did it like this at this company, or this is how we did it where I used to work, or whatever, right? What are your thoughts on that kind of side of things? And, you mentioned break down the walls. What do you think about that?
I mean, for me, I believe in strong beliefs loosely held. Right? That I think it is good to come in with that playbook. It is good to come in with that experience. But I've worked with hundreds of CEOs and hundreds of teams. 2 things will screw up teams and creativity more than anything. right? I think one is the people who come in blindly, who just apply that playbook to a team without understanding what's going on. So I think, using that as a guide, but coming in and making your own decisions to be able to do that. And I think, time after time after time, the biggest barrier to doing great work at most companies is basically the war over who's right. Right. And I think that's the other thing with leadership. Like, is design right? Is dev right? Is marketing right? Is the CEO right? Like, who cares? Like, seriously, if that's where all your energy is going, 9 times out of 10, your product is crap because you're focused on the wrong people. And so, again, I think that that's a lot of what it is it's good to have that experience, but you're not at that company anymore, right? You're not with those people anymore. There's no guarantee that because you hit a home run yesterday, it's going to win the game today. So I think that companies, whenever they hire, need to be harder on some of those people because sometimes they can get a little bit logo drunk, where it's like, I hate to break it to you, like, stupid people work at Apple. Right? Stupid people work at Google and Meta. Like, they're just because you work there doesn't mean you're a genius. And so again, I think be a little bit harder on hiring. But then, like I said, use that playbook as a starting point, but understand you're going to have to customize it. And if you apply it blindly, you will probably screw up what was working and make things actually worse.
Yeah, I fully believe that as well, because every time I've entered an organization, I've had these preconceived ideas or notions of how I'm going to tackle the job or the task at hand, or how I envision everything to be. And then as soon as I land, I'm like, oh, actually, that doesn't apply here. So now I'm going to have to figure something out fast, right? And I think some people ignore that feeling or don't have the awareness to kind of read the room, and they still try to apply what they learned or experienced elsewhere, and then end up kind of failing miserably, unfortunately. You mentioned quite a few different things. I want to just double tap on. You mentioned when you were Apple and Google, not everyone kind of is a genius, right? And you also kind of believe in, was it strong beliefs loosely held?
Mm-hmm.
Was there a time here in your kind of career where you have had very strong beliefs kind of going into these organizations, and you were convinced that you have to kind of change your mind, or the other way around, like you went into one of these organizations, like you were confronted by people that had strong beliefs, and you had to convince them, the other way.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, so yes to all of that. I mean, I think because in a lot of cases, I will view my role, or I think a lot of design, like, look, we're in the impact business, right? Like, we need to look at what is the impact on the business, what is the impact on people, and there's a lot of different ways that can go. I think a lot of what it is sort of just deciding what are the non-negotiables for you, right? Like, for me, that there's a level of work, there's a timeline that I want to do it on. Like, my time on this planet is finite. I want to make the most out of what that is. And look, I think not every hill is worth dying on. Not every fight is worth having, but some 100% are. And I think that, for me, it has been a very interesting journey. Just because I think, look, I spent the first 30 some odd years of my life, I think, probably showing up more as who I thought people wanted me to be and not who I actually am. And I have tattoos on both forearms dedicated to that mental health journey. I have Here's Are the Crazy Ones tattooed on my right arm. It's not an Apple fanboy tattoo. It's because, whenever I had the privilege of going to work with Apple for that amount of time, what I realized is that what made me sort of alienated or a little bit different with everybody else made me great there. And I think the moment whenever I started showing up as my authentic self, the moment that I started to say, look, what makes me different is my superpower, not my weakness, right? So the Here's Are the Crazy Ones to me is a reminder every single day. I look at it, it's on my right arm for a reason, right? Like, how do I need to show up? And I think for too many of us, we try to fit in. We try to be like everybody else. We feel like there's a right way to go through this sort of thing. And I think, there's a society that will try to convince us that like, no, if you're different, that's a weakness. When you are creative, that different perspective is 100% your superpower. And so I think those were the moments, I think one of just, for me, I've come to believe that sort of like being your authentic self is maybe one of the most rebellious things you can be, because a company wants you to be a certain employee, right? An industry wants you to act a certain way. And that standing up against that can be incredibly hard. And I think, leaders are often asked to come in and sort of like walk on water and change everything in a week, right? And it's not real. But I think, for me, that was the journey with, sort of a series of those kind of milestones of like, working in advertising and realizing that like, I am somebody who had paralyzing stage fright into my 20s. Like I couldn't talk to more than 3 people. Needed to work on that, right? That was a big realization that like, okay, I can improve myself and treat myself like a product. That no, the things that I thought alienated me are actually my strength, right? So I think that there's been a lot of those sort of core beliefs that have led to then when in those moments of saying, okay, look, yes, this is a fight that I want to have, or yes, like, this is something that we need to talk about. Because then I think you also get a good understanding of like, can I really do the work that I want to do? Can we build the team that we want to build? Because I think as creatives, I think maybe often we're a little bit too empathetic, where we just take whatever dumpster fire people give us and we make the best of it, and we don't really set ourselves up for success.
How can we navigate that? Like, if you're, say, it goes back to like I think you mentioned it was like CEO hysteria.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's pretty much the same thing what you're saying. So how do we navigate that? Like, how do we take these requirements and move on and stick to it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things that I've learned is like, look, if you want to scale your impact or you want to scale design, don't ever call it design. Because a lot of people will see design thinking, design systems and things like that. They view it as a mark of ownership, not as an approach. I think a lot of it for me is, understanding the world that you are going into, because I think a lot of design leaders kind of go like, why doesn't anybody understand us? And my argument is, why don't we understand them? So I think the ability to position things in ways that people understand, maybe sometimes it disguises it a little bit. Like I brought design thinking into like 300,000 people in Citibank. Never called it. Nobody wanted design thinking, right? They didn't get design thinking. They got a discovery mindset. Everybody wanted a discovery mindset, which from the title down was textbook IDEO design thinking, right? So I think one is understanding the culture that you're going into. 2, I think it is communicating and clearly defining what you are going to do. Because if you walk through the door as a new leader, you've got 3 to 6 months at most to show that there's an impact. And the problem is that most leaders, when they come in the door, they go quiet. The problem is with most organizations, whenever you do not define what you are doing and you do not define the path forward, they will define it for you. And now most of your energy is spent fighting what they think you should be, right? So for me, like I'll walk in the door and say, look, for the next 6 weeks, I'm talking to the teams. I'm getting these insights. I will be back in 6 weeks with what is the plan going to be, right? One is because my first concern is for my team. They are concerned about what is going on. Am I going to make changes? Am I smart? Am I crazy? I don't want to leave them in limbo because that's going to do damage, right? To the rest of the organization, it's you guys can take a full step back and let me go through and do this. And I'm going to communicate like what we are doing. So again, very similar to a design process of like, great, here's the initial concept. Here's the timing of what we're going to do. Here's where we start to execute on it. But I think doing a lot of those sort of things, because I think for too many of us, you also have to recognize that you need to be an evangelist, because no word, I think, has more meaning in an organization than design, right? For some companies, it's creativity. For others, it's organization. For some, it's production work, right? So I think, defining what those terms mean for them and what your path will be and communicating that and basically taking that control and kind of working through it that way. I think like those are the tangible things where whenever you come in, if you want to start to take control of things, because I need the freedom to figure stuff out. But I also, again, need to start to set a precedent for what is it going to be to work with like me and my team and sort of redefining what that role is.
Yeah. Some really great points here, Stephen, but especially on the evangelism as well. And, what do you do, Stephen, when people still don't get it? You've been doing all these things, you've kind of made an impact in that first 6 months, but there's still a bit of resistance and still a lack of understanding. Because I feel like in our industry, unfortunately, it's not a role, or it's not still, after this amount of years, people still don't fully understand the impact of design or what it can have on their organization. What do you do when people still don't get it?
So I'll give you some of my biggest tricks. One of the biggest things that I want to start to do is, one, I don't want to try to change the whole organization at once. It's not possible. Whenever I'm seeing that sort of resistance, when people just want to keep doing things the way that they've been doing, what I become very interested in is how do I start to create organizational jealousy? What that means is that what I'll often do is I will go find a team or go find a project that nobody cares about. Because what I know is that what will make people's opinions very pliable often is executive recognition. So again, like let's take the example of design thinking at Citibank. What I did was I said, look, instead of trying to go teach the whole marketing team or go teach the payments team, I went and found a team called Treasury and Transfer Services. Basically, they keep the pipes running in the bank. Nice people, not fun at parties. But so what I did is I went and taught them design thinking, right? And then all of a sudden they're shipping 7 times more product. They're doing sticky notes. They're doing these design thinking sprints. And I took the CEO down there and I said, showed him that. And he was like, what the hell is going on? And we showed him all the work and he was like, this is amazing. And I said, you know what? I know. Imagine if we did this for the whole bank. Because I think, one, for me, whenever you find those sort of teams or those projects, one, they tend to love the attention. They will easily work with you on things. If I go work on the biggest project or whatever it is, that's where there's the most resistance, the most red tape, the place where people are going to actually not want to work with me the most. But what I want to be able to do is, because what's amazing is all those people who had no interest in talking to me, now the CEO is excited, right? Now they're really interested in what this is. Now they want to kind of sort of talk about, now all those people are like, hey, can we work with you? Because I saw what you did over there and I'd really love that for my team. And so, again, I think some of it is, this is a little bit of the trick of leadership, is that there are sometimes you need to kind of come in through the side door on some of those things. One of the other tricks that I've done that works incredibly well is what I found is in every organization, there's a moment where you can change and get better, or there's a moment where you can keep doing what you've been doing, right? We've all sat in meetings. We've all been in that place where it's like, hey, we can do the hard thing, or we can just sort of let, the size of the organization win. And for me, there's always a get out of jail free card that basically every company has, right? It's like, well, welcome to working here, or this is the way we've always done it, or there's sort of this institutional apathy that kicks in. So, and when you say that, everybody's like, oh, it's okay, we can be mediocre. Always hated that moment. And so there's a number of companies I've gone into where I basically created an apathy swear jar. So if you said that phrase in my presence, you owed me $20. Because I wanted to get people to realize how often we were settling for mediocrity, right? How institutionalized that thinking had become. And look, I used the money to buy the team beer. I wasn't making my car payments with it, but it was look, one, we need to recognize this sort of mindset. And the other thing that I've done that I know a lot of teams have done that worked really well is what I used to do was I would call it the belly flop of the week. So, because what I realized is so many teams are so focused on being perfect, nobody was learning. Nobody was being creative. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to reward the people that took the risk. So we'd have teams with product and dev and design. And what I'd do is there'd be a part where you could basically get up there and talk about who screwed up the biggest, right? What went wrong? What did you learn from it? And we would give you a bottle of champagne and a trophy because I wanted to institutionalize and reward taking the risk. Right? That it wasn't about the destination, it was about the journey. So I think that there's a lot of these things in very big and very small ways of how do I understand how to get into the structure and get into what this is? Because whenever you look at it, right, 75% of transformation work fails. And the reason why it fails comes down to 2 reasons. One, the people that are a part of it are not empowered to make any change. So it's a bunch of executives who say, hey, we're going to do something different. Nobody's actually empowered to do anything different. But fundamentally, what happens is that they change behavior. They don't change thinking. Behavior meaning we'll have few less meetings or we'll say some different words, but the underlying thinking, which is the problem, doesn't change. Right? So I think all of this for me is I'm trying to attack the thinking. Because if I can change that, if I can change the way we think about risk, the way that we think about mediocrity, the way that we think about those sort of things, then I can create real change in an organization, not just the wallpaper that makes the problems look a little nicer.
These are all amazing points that you're mentioning here, Stephen. And I don't know, I kind of get the feeling that, this is experience over years, right? That you've kind of cultivated. How do you kind of feel that new leaders can kind of get this? Like, how do we cultivate new leaders, right? Because even my personal opinion is I was not the leader I am today. Like 6 or 7 years ago, I was a very different leader. I got a lot of things wrong. Is it something that just takes time, or leaders born, or can we cultivate the next set of design leaders?
No, I mean, we can. And I think there's a lot of work and a lot of things I've been involved in. Like, look, I'd love to see more design-led founders. I think that there's a lot of us where I think that we're either too empathetic or we doubt ourselves too much, right? Like, this is where I often joke, like, this is why stupid people are successful, because they just jump, right? But I think that a lot of what it is for me is like, a big part of leadership, I think, is giving yourself the grace to go on the journey. Because who I am today, who I am in 6 months, 12 months, years down the road is going to change. You're not going to lead like everybody else. And that's a good thing, right? You're going to learn as you go. And that's a good thing. That I think, just being open and giving yourself the grace. And that's why I said, before, like, you need a plan, not the answer. I think just understanding that it's going to be a journey. And like, yes, you will get more senior. And there are people who are natural leaders and very charismatic. There are people I know who are amazing leaders who are incredibly introverted, and it's taken longer for them to be able to do that. But again, I think that's where, for me, if you feel like there's a script or there's a way that you have to do it, I think that destroys more great leaders than anything. Because it's like, look, if you aren't this alpha extroverted standing on a table screaming "Captain, my captain" kind of a thing, then it's like, oh, you must not be a real leader. And I also believe, though, that for me, that you need to be able to cultivate and create teams where leadership comes from everywhere, right? Because I think one of the things that I've often tried to do, and I think the best leaders have the ability of pushing the power down through their organizations and their teams. I don't want everybody sitting around just waiting on me to make a decision. It's fascist, it's boring, it doesn't work. Right. So I think that ability to also sort of understand that, because in a lot of ways, one of the best pieces of advice I ever got is like, you need to almost think about leadership like you're running a sports franchise. Right. You have the top of the tier, top of the table, like, the A team that's doing that. But come next season, maybe you can't re-sign your star player. Right. Maybe they want to go someplace else and make more money. Maybe they're going to want to go to the opposition or something like that. So how am I cultivating the B team and the C team, and how am I developing those sort of people? How am I bringing them along? How am I investing in those leadership skills, that it isn't just one day where it's like, oh, you've been here the longest, you should be in charge. That's a career path not everybody wants, right? And I think also realizing that leadership should also not be the only path in your organization for advancement. And I think a lot of companies, it's like, some people just don't want to, it's not what they want to do. That's not what they're good at. That's not their gift. It doesn't mean they don't have astounding value. Right. But I think thinking about, sort of that succession and generational approach of how am I developing these people that in a year or two, if somebody moves on, I can move them up. But I think that I always sort of think about it in that sports franchise metaphor of kind of like, because usually I've got a salary cap, which is my budget. Right. Like there's a lot of parallels between that. I think I study a lot of sports psychology for that reason, because I think there's a lot of parallels between creativity and sports psychology. But then that way you're developing those sort of people, and it isn't just great, you're next in line, good luck.
Yeah, and Stephen, I have to also call that out as well, right? I love the analogy of sports as a way to kind of look at great leaders, because I also think that there's no other role in the world that is scrutinized as much as a manager of a team, right? Some kind of sports team, right? We know exactly what they're doing. We know exactly their tactics, how they're developing teams, or who they've signed, and all these kind of things, right? I don't know if there's any other role other than sports we scrutinize leadership as much, you know?
The only other one that I tend to gravitate to a lot is actually chefs. Because I think as you look at really high end, like so I've sought out sports managers and I've sought out some of the world's best chefs, because to me, like if I'm running a 3 Michelin star top 50 restaurant in the world, how do you take some 18-year-old kid out of culinary school and plug them into that and have them like actually start to produce? And I think there's been a lot of great advice out of that, because I think like when you talk to a lot of chefs, they'll say the first thing they do is send those people out to go eat at great restaurants, because they're like, you can't cook great food if you haven't eaten great food, right? So the ability to have a palate, to understand what is great, right? I think that's another thing for me, and a lot of creativity. If you aren't constantly seasoning your palate and keeping yourself relevant, because especially when you're a leader, you tend to get a little bit further away from the tools. But I think, in a lot of cases it is helpful, because if you can look at it through the lens of another industry, that I think will often, they need to share the creative and corporate condition. Sports is there to make money. They're there to sell jerseys. They're there to do what that is. But again, players are also very emotional. So, but I think, doing those so I think I've always tended to look almost outside of our industry for those sort of insights, because I find them a lot more useful than trying to maybe necessarily look at other design leaders. But I think that's just, it's a little bit maybe a quirky thing that I do.
Yeah, and the chef one for me is also a brilliant one. I like that one, Stephen. That's the new one for me, because, one thing that we see a lot of new leaders doing is trying to cook all the dishes for the other chefs, right? And trying to jump on all the stations and kind of really, get involved, when I guess what they really want to be doing is just tasting, right? And telling them how they can do it better.
But if you think about it, right? Because again, I think running a restaurant is very similar to the creative process, because you have to go from like this wild creativity of how do we keep coming up with new dishes and new things to bring people into the restaurant, right? Like we can't just sit on where we've been. So you have to go from that wild creativity of like, we need something new and innovative, to then you have to cook that dish the exact same way every single night, right? So that's this incredibly meticulous prep and execution. And so there are these wild swings between that sort of visionary leadership and creativity with then this very structured, thoughtful execution. And so I think that's why I tend to look at restaurants of like, how do they create culture, right? How do you manage those sort of swings? How do you develop talent? Because when your sous chef wants to go start his own restaurant, how do you keep that sort of rating year over year? And so again, I think, that's a lot of it for me, is just there's a lot of parallels there when you start to dig in.
Kind of rings that true to me as well. And I think everything that you mentioned, especially with the analogies of sports, the chefs, I think it all ends up kind of revolving around systems. And I'm really kind of keen to understand what your thoughts are on some of the systems that you can play on, like design teams, design systems, and how effective do you think they are?
No. I mean, look, I think I'm the guy that for years like buys my whole team and tries to teach systems thinking, because I think, if you look at a lot of working with AI, systems thinking, design systems thinking, right? Like a lot of those sort of things of understanding how to work with engineering, or a lot of other things like that, is, how do I create structure and repetition? And like, I think in a lot of cases, systems thinking is what differentiates design from art, right? Is that there is a structure and a purpose to what it is. But while I also am a huge advocate for systems thinking, I think the other part of what we're talking about with sports are the things like that often gets overlooked, is emotion. Because I do think, to me, that's why I study sports psychology, because I think for me, creativity is emotional. Creating like what looks like what happens whenever like a child explodes for what my office looks like, is because I want to create a space that puts me in the head space to be creative, right? Again, like when you study sports psychology, you talk about like a baseball player or something like that, they'll talk about when they're really in the zone, you look at the ball and it looks like a beach ball, right? Like I can't miss it. But when I'm really struggling, it looks like a BB. I think creativity is very much the same way. So how do I keep myself and my team in the headspace and create the spaces to be creative, right? To do a lot of those sort of things. And I think that's where the systems actually allows that to happen, is that if you have the process and the structure and the understanding of how do I create the spaces for creativity to happen? How do I create the trust? How do I create the emotional safety? How do I create those sort of things? That it is this balance between the very emotional and the very logical, because I think you need to be able to have both, because I think for the systems to work, they only work if they have people who are bought into the system inside of them, right? We all have seen like a process that is just a bunch of steps that people go through because they have to. They don't care about it. It doesn't actually work. It isn't doing what it's supposed to. They're just checking boxes, right? So I think for me, that there is always that push and pull, right lane, right brain, left brain, sort of push and pull between the structured and the emotional. That, you know, I tend to be very systematic. I've approached my career that way, of getting faster at concepting, of being able to do a lot of things, because like if I sit down with the CEO, they don't want me to be smart in 3 weeks. I need to say something smart now, right? So a lot of that, how do I continue to have that process going, but then also understanding how do I balance my experience and my ego with the humility to keep me going and learning. And one of my best friends has a line that always rings in my head, where it's just like, hustle until you don't have to introduce yourself. And I think, like, so for me, there's that kind of like work ethic. But so again, I think it's that push and pull that, you know, too many companies go, I think, towards the process side, not realizing that you need the emotional side as well, because that's a lot harder to coach and lead, and it's easier to just lean into the process side.
I wanna sidestep slightly, and just kind of unpick the role of design systems, because selfishly, I want to get your kind of view on a kind of a problem that I'm kind of currently facing. And
Sure.
we've and design system has been matured, evolved, paid its role, got consistency thing. And now you get to a point where you think, well, does this design system need to be scalable to support everything? In which case it needs to be rigid, or do we need to be more like creative? And then I suppose, does that mean that the design system needs to be more flexible? And do you know, as an organization, which direction to kind of head down, or kind of when is the right time to be scalable versus flexible? And also, do you believe that in the long term, design systems are more of an hindrance on creativity?
Yeah, so I'll give you a little bit of a disappointing answer, and then I'll explain it, right? So for me, it's both, right? Like, design systems have to be freedom in a framework. No, I do not believe that, because I've heard the people that talk about design systems like it's a sticker sheet, or like, and for me, if you think your career and your creative success is going to be based on your ability to design a button, right, or a new button every time you work on something, you're going to have a real crap career, right? So I think that for me, whenever I look at branding, whenever I look at design systems, all of this is that we need systems and we need consistency, right? And I think that for me, a lot of times the burden is on designers. Like, look, you need to be better, because it is easier to break the system, to create something new, to go outside the brand guidelines, to go outside the system guidelines. Like, for me, like, at the end of the day, when we talk about we're in the impact business, design systems should let you focus on the impact, right? Like, not creating a 17th new button style. So no, I do not believe in that at all. But for me, whenever you build a design system, I think that it is freedom in a framework, because I think you need part of that process that is just constantly going through and refining and taking what you have and listening to what's working and listening to what's not. Because if a design system becomes too rigid, it becomes an excuse, right? Meaning people will stop working with it because they're like, oh, I can't do what I want, right? Because it's so rigid, and then they go build other ones, or they hire an agency to go do something else, and then it all starts to fall apart. So it can't be so rigid and inflexible. So I think, like, look, you need a team. Like, whenever I've done it, we publish a backlog, right? We have monthly meetings for you to be able to come and show your work or talk about what's working or what's not. We're gathering feedback. We're treating it like a product, right? No product can ever be so, like, you know, stuck in place that it can't be able to do that. So I think you have to be able to have that piece of it where there is structure, there is purpose, there is consistency, because and look, in a lot of cases, what I've actually proven is like the ability to do that will probably help us work up to about 40% faster, because we can just skip the whole, like we can either go into high fidelity wireframes right away. We can like use that design system, because we will pick up both design efficiency and dev efficiency, and that we aren't having to recode everything every time, right? So there's a huge amount of benefits for there. And I think, again, for me, it's teaching designers that, look, I get the designing something new is fun, but we need to understand sort of, again, what we're doing here. But I think the other part of that design system is the other part of what you're talking about, is that you do need to be looking to the future, right? Of, whether it's expanding the system, do we have patterns for haptics? Do we have like a sonic identity of like, what is our sound design process? Like, do we start to build it out like past just the basics of, form fields and, buttons and those sort of things, to be able to get into the bigger organisms? But also, where is this going? Because I think like you again have to think about technology is evolving, standards are evolving, right? That again, if it becomes sort of a moment in time, then again, it will become an excuse. So I think that for me, that's why I've always kind of said, like, for me, I view it as freedom and a framework, because I think if you go too far to the process and the rigid side, it'll fail. If you go too far to the like dreamy someday, then everything's always different. You have no consistency, no efficiency, right? Then it fails. So I've always tried to kind of walk the line right down the middle.
Yeah, I find it very interesting because when they started kind of maturing, and everyone saw the benefits of design systems, like, oh my gosh, so we've got this consistent product, it's beautiful, we've got standards and principles in place. And then in more recent years, I would say in the last maybe 5 or 6 years, I've noticed a bit of a shift in terms of attitude from designers in terms of the creativity side of it. Like what you said, I can't do what I want to do.
Right.
And now I'm at a point where I'm kind of thinking, well, as leaders, how can we start driving that creativity still whilst maintaining all of that hard work that went into establishing these design systems?
Right.
Going forward. Yeah. So it's a challenge. I'm not sure what the answer is at the moment. But I do like what you mentioned about thinking to the future, thinking about emerging technologies, thinking about tips and ways that customers might be interfacing.
Yeah, I would definitely, I mean, look, what I would say is I definitely, if your designers are having that reaction, that's like a check engine light, right? Like you need to start to look at that and think about that, and either, again, start to say, okay, look, maybe we need to open this up a little bit more. Are there things that we can do to evolve? Are there, maybe it's, I just do a rolling evolution of, okay, great, we just want to update some things as we go, or we want to bring in new components, or we want to do whatever that is. I think, the other thing that I have also discovered is that's why I would sort of have those monthly meetings where it's like, great, if you are frustrated, come and propose something new. Like, because part of it is for me is I also want to weed out that mentality a little bit of like, it's okay to just sit on the sidelines and complain. Like, if you're willing to step up and do something about it, let's go. Right. But if it's just kind of like, oh, I just want to, design a new brand every week, you may be at the wrong company.
Yeah. And that's some good points there, Stephen. I think you're right. I guess it's also about how you mentor these designers, to kind of have that better thinking about how to approach these things, and to have more open-mindedness to still having the creativity in that structure, So yeah, and on mentoring, 200 sessions, 5,000 minutes.
Probably more than that by
list.
now, but yeah.
Probably more, right? But I mean, big numbers, Stephen, right? Where did this kind of passion of mentoring come about?
Yeah, so I think my journey through the industry has been an interesting one, and I think this was something I only realized myself a few years ago, because I had the really interesting perspective that my dad did what I did, right? He was a creative director. He ran his own agency. He did a lot of those sort of things. So I think I actually had the benefit of watching an entire career, right? In that was, ahead of me in doing what I do. So I think it gave me a really interesting perspective. What I didn't realize, so I think for, honestly, it started in a very ego-driven way of when I got laid off for the first time, it was like, look, important people teach, important people stand on stages. Like I should do that. But I think a lot of what it was, like I said, and it's telling the story a little bit backwards, was about 2 years before my dad passed, he came to me because I was doing a lot of things like that. And he said, you know what, if I would have known you while I was still working, my career would have been completely different. Because what I never kind of consciously realized was how bad my father had imposter syndrome, how much he struggled with being a leader, how much he struggled with sort of the fire hose of rejection that you can get in this industry. And even after he passed away, like I cleaned out his studio to find years of ideas that never went anywhere, of postcards that he printed that never got mailed, right? And it kind of hit me like a freight train that I think, a big part of why I do the podcast or I try to help people was like in some ways it was trying to save my dad, because I don't want to see anybody else go through what he went through, to suffer in silence, to be able to not talk about mental health, to be able to not talk about a lot of these sort of issues. I think that's why I started the podcast and everything else. So I love it. I love making that difference. But I think a lot of it for me was just, I've seen that career from start to finish. Right? I've seen what happens when in the early years you're trying to struggle for relevancy and to break in, right? Like, I mean, I always laugh. Like, I feel like my career was Goldilocks. Like, I went from not having enough experience to too much, and somehow I missed where I had just enough, right? But I think, I've seen that as you get on in your career and you get more senior, how you try to struggle for relevancy and to feel like you're still a part of, I mean, it's a lot of leaders I talk to now with AI and other things coming in. So I think I did it for a lot of years without realizing that's why I was doing it. That, for me, I didn't want to see people go through that pain or to just, and I think that's why even as a leader, I tend to be the person that says the thing that everybody's thinking. But so I think, so back in 2020, Felix Lee and James Badawar, one lives in Singapore and one lives in West Africa, like COVID had just hit. And they came to me and they said, look, we've got this idea. We want to build this platform to try to help people find jobs and, maybe mentoring too. It was about 4 years ago. It was a Google sheet. And we just said, look, if you've got a job, put it up there. If you need mentoring, put it up there. And so the Amazing Design People list was born out of that. 4 years later, I think we're over 10,000 mentors. I forget, it's like 10 million minutes of. So I think it's a platform where we basically said, look, if you want to talk to the world's best design leaders for free, here's a platform to do that. So I think, it's a great way to be able to scale it. Felix is an incredible founder. But that's where it comes from, right? And I think it was amazing for me that I did it for so many years and never really understood why until I had that moment. It was about 2 years before he passed with my dad, where he was just like, yeah, that's like, if I'd have known you, my career would have been totally different.
That is inspirational, right? I mean, hearing that conversation with your dad, and yeah, I feel, Stephen, like, a lot of people want to get into mentoring. It's not always for the right reasons though, right? And I think, your experience there is definitely getting into it for the right reasons. Do you have any tips for people like, wanting to get into mentoring, or, what should they be doing and why should they get into it?
Yeah. And I think like one of the things that I think I've discovered is like when it comes to mentoring or just how you move through the industry, right? Like you can either be the inspiration or you can be the warning, right? You can be the person that people want to be, or you can be the boss that people swear they will never be. And I think that for me, it's much like doing public speaking or doing a podcast or doing mentoring, right? Like if you're getting into it because you want fame or you want recognition or you want to be able to do those sort of things, you're going to do more damage and you're not going to find what you're looking for. Right. I think if you are getting into it to say, because to me, the reason why I think I like doing mentoring, the reason why I like doing podcasting or anything else is that it helps me just as much as it helps them. Right. If I can share that experience, if I can share that insight, if I can try to not have somebody step on that grenade that I stepped on a couple times, right, then we all get better. I think part of it for me is because it's paying forward the people who helped me. But I think, my advice to that is like, look, I think a lot of people say they don't want to get into mentoring because they feel like they don't have enough experience. If you've been in this industry a day, you have enough experience, right? You have life experience. You have a unique perspective. You have something to share that I think that's one of the things that I discovered like to me, that's still a little bit crazy. Like, I feel like I get paid to travel around the world and work with clients and stand on stages to talk about stuff that I think is incredibly obvious. Right? Like, it seems natural to me. Like, why would anybody want to hear that? But for some reason, whenever I stand on a stage or I say it, everybody seems to write it down. So it's like, okay, maybe it's not obvious. And again, and I think that's the leaning into the superpower, that what makes you different is what makes you great. So it doesn't matter how much experience you have, right? Like, I tell people all the time, like, for me, it's not the years, it's the mileage. I know people in their 20s who are some of the most mature, most amazing creatives I know. And I know some people in their 60s who couldn't fall off a boat and hit water. Right. So it's like, look, it's about, if you have something that you want to, you want to be able to share. I think it is great on a personal level, because I think there's no better way to fight imposter syndrome than to have somebody who actually feels like you have something you can teach them. Right. So I think that for me, it's part of why I do that, is because it's part of how do I keep myself in a good space? How do I create time to think about these issues? Like, one of my biggest development goals over the last couple of years, oddly, has just been, I want to be bored more. Like, I'm so consumed with waking up in the morning and being on my phone and coming down here and doing this sort of stuff, and then sitting, watching TV and going to bed and doing it all over again. There's not a moment to be creative, right? So it's like, go for a walk or do things like that. But I think it's amazing what you will discover through that sort of mentoring. It's amazing the relationship and the network that you build. And I also just think that, like, look, I've had a lot of hard conversations with more senior leaders lately who want to do their own thing or want to go in a different direction. And they've been, very self-centered or very egotistical. And, they don't tend to find much support now. And they're like, well, how do I do, what do I do? And it's like, be a different person 10 years ago. But I think that for me, that's the thing that by saying yes to things, right? By being human, by listening to people, by trying to give back. Because I think, a lot of it for me also is like, if you don't like the way the industry is, if you don't like the way your company is, if you don't like the way the world is, right? Like, for me, modeling the behavior you want will always be far more powerful than complaining about the behavior you don't. Right? I think showing up in that way and saying, okay, look, I'm going to be the one to do it or to be the change. Like, even if because I just don't think the impact you're going to have. Right? And I think for me, I discovered that in shocking ways after I started my podcast, in ways that I would never have expected. That, I've had at this point 7 different designers who have sought me out at different conferences and things like that, who said they were literally on the edge of taking their own life because they felt so disenfranchised, so disconnected, right? But like, something I said one time in a show helped them, right? Because if you look at it logically, the world did not need another podcast from an old white guy, right? They don't need it. But I think if you look at it that way, where you don't know the impact you're going to have, like, I never would have imagined. Like, again, I got an email the other day from a guy on an oil rig who was like, yeah, your show on design thinking, like, really helped us fix this problem on an oil rig. It's like, what? Right? But I think that it is a really, really great way into the journey of self-belief, right? Because I think a lot of around leadership and a lot of being around a great creative is just accepting who you are, right? And I think talking about it out loud on a regular basis, sharing your successes and your failures, is a great way to do it.
Yeah. And I think, Stephen, one area that I've definitely noticed as well when doing some mentoring is it's also helped me as an individual as well, right? They say that the best way to learn something is teaching someone else, right? But then also the best way to kind of develop yourself as well, I guess, mentoring others, because they ask you questions that you maybe not reflected on, right? And that bring up certain things that you haven't really thought about, but actually you have overcome those things. Have there been any key moments like that for you where you've kind of been speaking to someone and that's opened up some things?
No, constantly, right? And I think, you couldn't have said it any better, because I think, one, it helps maybe you see yourself a little bit differently. That they'll see something in you that you never recognized, and they're like, oh, I love this about what you do. And it's like, I didn't even realize I do that. But I think that for me, doing the podcast and doing mentoring is that it is, again, every single week, finding time to be vulnerable, finding time to be self-reflective, finding time to Because I think, again, that's what a lot of us don't do, is that if you're an athlete, you'd go practice, right? If you're a singer, you think about your voice as your instrument. I don't know that we think about our creativity and our emotional state as our instruments. But yeah, I think that for me, there's always a lot of times like that. And it's funny because in a lot of mentoring sessions, it's sort of like, shit, what did I say? I need to write that down. Like, I need to remember to do that. But I think that that's a lot of cases where what people get stuck into, and I definitely get stuck into that, is that, like, I think discomfort is the cost of fulfillment, right? Being open to those conversations and somebody challenging you on, why did you say that? I don't agree with that. Great, let's talk about it, right? Like, hey, why did you do that? I agree with that. Great, let's talk about it. But I think it's for me, it's getting into, again, that sort of system of just being open to seeing what that conversation is and where does it go, right? Because I think that for a long time, I used to have a poster that sat in a lot of my offices that said, comfort is the enemy of greatness. And I think that it's very easy to get comfortable. It's very easy to feel like I've had some level of success. It's very easy to just sort of cocoon yourself in and say, this is who I am. And then usually in 3, 4, 5 years later, go, why am I not happy? Do I need to change industries? Like, just because you start to get comfortable. So I think, for me, that there's that ability to just lean into getting comfortable being uncomfortable. But I think there's so many benefits on both sides. Like, again, I've grown immeasurably as a designer, a leader, and honestly, just as a person from being able to do it.
Yeah, and it's inspirational, Stephen. And, I think one of your podcasts that you did, actually, I remember the specific one, because when you went live with it, or when you kind of launched it, the episode, I was kind of shocked because I hadn't seen many people talking about this. But it kind of gave me some comfort as well. It was when you were speaking about your redundancy, right? So you went through a period where, you lost a role and it was a bit of a difficult time for you. Do you want to just talk to us a bit about that? And how did you come up with the courage to kind of talk about that on your podcast as well, like inspiring others around that? Can you tell us a bit about that episode?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I literally, so just this morning came back to that theme, and the latest episode of my podcast is called How to Get Laid Off. It's been interesting, right? Because I think for a long time, so I've been laid off 3 times in my career. And that's often try to remind people that, like, look, either you know that you're replaceable or you work long enough to find that out, right? Like, I've been laid off coming off of 8 Apple keynotes with my work running globally in an Apple commercial. One time I got laid off, I was having lunch at Cupertino in Infinite Loop, and they laid me off there, right? It's an incredibly hard moment where I think way too many people suffer in silence. Because I think that, and I get asked about it a lot, even when it was weird. Like, Debbie Millman asked me whenever I did Design Matters. She's like, why didn't you just say, like, you decided to go another direction? And it's like, because it's a lie. I think that we need to understand how much pain and trauma that moment causes. I think for a lot of people, especially lately, who felt like they were part of a family or in an industry that couldn't be affected, it is impossible to go through that process, because intellectually I will understand that my position was eliminated because of a bunch of executives made bad decisions that put a company in a position where they had to downsize, right? Or there was an economy, or that there was something bigger than me. But at the end of the day, whenever I lay in bed at night, I'm still left with the thought that they kept other people and not me. And the number of people that I have talked to and mentored who just cannot bring themselves to even put that little green ring on LinkedIn that says open to work, because they see it as a mark of failure. They see it as a scarlet letter. They see it as, something that, again, is a mark of their failure. And I think just way too many people have suffered in silence going through that. I've learned the hard way that I think you don't know how much support you have until you ask for it. I think that the job hunt is probably one of the most inhuman, I think, processes you can go through, because it is essentially you just saying, can somebody please validate my life? Can you tell me that I made good decisions? Can you tell me that you think I have value? And I think for a lot of people, it puts them into a very dark place whenever you apply to 100 jobs and you don't hear anything back, right? So for me, I think, I've spent a lot of time trying to talk about those moments. I think the last time I got laid off, I went extremely publicly through the fact that I'd gotten laid off again and what that process was like and how much of a, failure the process was and some of those things in what was a difficult and mildly humiliating sort of way. But I think that for me, it's a natural part of what this is. And I think that there's a lot of parts of creativity in this business that we need to pull out from the shadows. We need to be there to support people. We need to normalize what this process is like. We need to help not have it be so associated with failure and shame. So I think that for all of those reasons, that's why I've always shared my journey around it, or why I try to help others, because I just think so many people are sitting there in so much pain and silence, not knowing the support they have, not knowing how common a lot of this is, not even understanding what the process is going to be, right? And it's just you feel discarded.
That resonates a lot with me, actually, because I know a lot of people that have been kind of affected layoffs. I've spoken to a lot of people, especially the past 18 months or so. And there have been kind of common themes. A lot of it is due to what you said, not necessarily being aware of support is actually happening. And I would say that one thing that has often kind of come to me through these kind of conversations is there's a fear of being judged by the community.
Oh, sure.
And also, like, going back to what you said about people being kind of fearful of putting that green ring that says, open to work on LinkedIn. There's a perception out there that they're going to be kind of discounted by hiring managers.
Yeah.
Because, if one company didn't want you, then why is this company going to want you?
Right.
How can we change the narrative around that mindset? Going to give people a bit more kind of confidence.
Yeah.
Forcefully.
Well, and look, and I think it's hard. I think that for me, I've sort of developed almost a little bit of a defiant mindset. It's a little bit of why I built my personal brand, because if I go to a company, I want it to mean something. If I leave, it probably says more about them than me. And so I think, a lot of what it is just because they laid you off or just because they made bad decisions, it doesn't diminish your talent. It doesn't diminish your impact. I tend to be in the mindset that, like, success is the best revenge. I think that there are moments when anger and frustration can be useful emotions. Sometimes that's a moment to tap into that of, like, I'm going to go show them. But I think, look, it's like, if you know people who are going through that, reach out to them on a regular basis. Ask one simple question. What can I do to help? Right. I think, a lot of cases for those sort of people that are trying to get back on their feet, the thing that I'll often tell them to do is to go out to the people you trust, you respect, coworkers, ex-coworkers, significant others, friends, family, whatever it is. Ask them to just simply describe you in 3 words, 3 individual words. Why do they love you? Why do they think you're great? What is your impact? Right? Because I think that in so many cases, what you need to do in that moment, and what I'll try to coach people on, is how do you build an economy of hope? Because I think that's, there's not much hope going through a job interview process, right? Like, what do I have to look forward to? How do I create hope? How do I feel like I have control over something in a moment where I feel like all the control has been taken away from me? And so I think that's what, for me, you start to focus on. Like, again, I think applying for jobs on LinkedIn is incredibly toxic, right? Do you feel like you're doing something every day? Yes. Are you going to have any success? You probably literally would have better success in winning the lottery. Right. So, like, reach out to your network, talk to people in that moment where it's very hard, because, some people will rush in and be there to support. Some people act like you got a terminal disease, right? Where they don't know what to say and it's very uncomfortable. So it's like, great, try to go out and talk to them. But I think that's what a lot of what it is just how do you focus on those moments of finding some control or finding some hope, or being able to, again, remember the good things that you did. Remember the good work that you did. Remember the impact that you had. Not because I think, like, I've seen so many people, they've been in a company for 5 years. They focus on those last 2 days. Right. Like, and for me, I've developed a system where, like, honestly, I will spend up to 2 weeks being angry, right? Being hurt, screaming, crying, like, just it needs to I need to have an emotional reaction and process this, because I'm also oftentimes dealing with a moment that's not going to have a resolution, right? At no point is me probably getting laid off going to make sense. So what I need to do is to not make sense of it. I need to make peace with it. So I'll say, look, I'm going to give myself 3 days, 5 days, 2 weeks at most, be pissed off, wallow, lay on the couch, binge watch Netflix, play PlayStation, do whatever, but then I need to get things back together, right? And then I think it is that, like, great, and I'll often sort of describe it as like I get ready to go to war. How do I get my book and my portfolio together? How do I get my story together? How do I talk about what the impact is? How do I not, it's almost like, how do I not let them win? Because I do think in some ways, right, like if you sit on the sidelines and you give into that emotion, then it kind of feels like maybe they were right. And I think I develop a very defiant mindset of like, nope, I'm going to go show them and everybody else. Like, I'm just going to go do it someplace else, and they're going to figure out what they missed out on. But again, in that moment, how do you focus on building hope? Because I think then that starts to carry you forward.
That's amazing advice there. Like, honestly, like you, like, I guess, how do you get someone to, I guess, get up off that sofa, the remote control down?
Yeah.
Just attack it. Because I think based on what you're saying is like, I love the phrase that you mentioned, like, just treat it like you're going to war. But that takes like a certain spark or inside someone to really ignite and just like give them that drive and energy to just like power up and just go from it. I guess, what can we do as a community to give people that sort of kind of, I don't know what to call it, like
accountability.
Yeah, I suppose it's accountability.
So this is my piece of advice, right? Because I think, and this is true in any self-development and anybody who wants to get better, right? Because I think for a lot of us, it's incredibly easy for us to let ourselves down, right? Today's not the day. The weather wasn't right. I didn't feel good. I sneezed this morning, right? Like there's some reason why I'm not going to do it today. My advice is think about which one of your really good friends is the biggest pain in the ass, right? Which one is the one that is going to hold you the most accountable to doing something? And go tell that person how long you're going to be angry and then what you're going to do. Because what I've discovered is while it's very easy for me to let myself down and rationalize why I'm not going to do something, if I know that there is somebody that is going to hold me accountable and I'm going to hear about it, it is amazing then the results I get, because I think this is basic coaching behavioral science, right? So I think that is, how do you create that accountability where, if I lay on the couch today and I don't actually make progress on that, I know this person's going to come over, knock on my door, blow up my phone, do something. Because then I think once you start to get that momentum and you create some of that accountability and then you get up and going, because I think, a lot of, I've led behavioral science teams and things like that, is that, you also have to remember that, like, whenever it comes to making those sort of changes, it usually takes, 3 weeks to make a habit and 90 days to make a lifestyle. It's not going to happen overnight. But find some way of creating that accountability of somebody who's going to say, look, get your ass off the couch. Like, we're going to sit down together and do this. We're going to have an intervention if they need to or whatever it is. But find some way of creating that accountability, because again, your natural state is going to be to say like, poor me.
Yeah. Accountability is definitely key to get yourself out of that kind of situation, right, Stephen? So no, I think brilliant advice on that one. Really interesting topics. And like, Stephen, I think before, I want to make sure we cover this, right? Because it's quite a topical discussion point at the moment, which is InVision, right? Because it's a big part of your journey, right? Working at InVision. And actually, I think it was the way that I actually found you online, Stephen. I think that was the first kind of time I saw you, was whilst you was working at InVision. I think you did some talks there and some kind of stuff was blowing up around InVision. Obviously, for anyone that doesn't know, InVision's kind of decided to pivot away from the collaboration tool, right, which they used to have, Vision Studio, right?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that, Stephen? And any insight into why you think that's kind of happened over the years?
Yeah, so I think I was at InVision for a couple of years. I think 1 year where it was relevant and a bunch where it wasn't. I think when we were in InVision, they always sort of talked about like, oh, they were going to write a book about the company. And I think they always thought they were going to write it for a very different reason than why they might actually do it. InVision is a case study of how do you create an entirely new segment in a market, in prototyping, in collaborative work, in a lot of those sort of things. And then how do you completely lose that advantage by being unwilling to evolve. And I think that, they went in and they got a lot of corporate clients and a lot of big things and felt like that would keep them safe. And I think, that was a lot of conversations internally around, like, why are we trying to build Studio and a design tool? Like, are we partnering with other people? Or are we our own product? We had a lot of secondary products that got ignored for a long time, right? I think, InVision did a lot of amazing things. They're a pioneer in remote work. I think that, going into the pandemic, working at InVision was fascinating because you went from sort of being this like weird sideshow of like, look at them, aren't they cute? They all work from home. To then I spent like 2 years with every CEO who could get time with me saying, okay, how do we do remote work? So I think it was ahead of its time in a lot of ways. But I think it was that inability to really read the market, to read that, the online was coming into play, that collaborative was becoming a much bigger thing, that like a file you kept on your desktop was dying, that like, again, you need to be able to kind of stay up with what that was, and that, we hadn't created a strong enough and distinct enough product that it couldn't be integrated. Because I think that's where you saw Figma came and ate their lunch, because, then all of a sudden you could do prototyping and you could do a lot of those sort of things. And it's just, they started to react to that far too late. And so I think, they're down to where freehand, which is like their whiteboarding tool, is I think kind of all that's left of the company. But you had such an amazing collection of Eli Woolery and Aaron Walter and like so many other people who were there, where you had such, I think that the content that got put out of there and with design leadership forum, things like that were phenomenal. But it just, I think it you can definitely see that just because you have a great first act doesn't mean that you're going to have the same success in your second act.
Yeah, some great learnings there for companies, right? And do you think, I know it's probably hard to envision this, excuse the pun, right? But do you think Figma could go down that same route? I know they're trying to pivot in a few different new areas, right? Do you think they could ever be overspun? Because I think Sketch was another tool that I never thought would get overturned.
Yeah, I mean, but if you think about it, right? Like, it started with like Future Splash that turned into Macromedia Flash, that turned into Adobe, that then turned into, that then kind of started to pivot into Illustrator a bit. Then it went into Sketch, and then now it's gone into Figma. I think one is, as designers, like, we love the new, right? I think that's why we're a little drunk right now with the 9 million different AI engines you can use and like so many options. And look, I think Figma's done a better job than most at keeping up with what that is and pivoting. I think, there's a little bit of an interesting step of, and I think it was very interesting to watch Slack get bought and the potential acquisition of Figma by Adobe, where people were sort of like, well, no, we're supposed to be independent and, we're supposed to be, and it's like, this is still a business. So I think, the failed acquisition by Adobe was definitely kind of an interesting, but I think a very understandable move by Adobe, an interesting move by Figma. But I think they're at a critical juncture where it's like, look, you're starting to get to a size where does that size start to slow down your innovation? Because the platform gets bigger, there's more function. Again, we've seen that with Adobe, where it's just like the products start to bloat and releases are further apart because you just have to do it in different languages and on different platforms. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see, can they stay that scrappy? Because I think, look, we're starting to see, more and more contenders with Framer and with other ones that are coming in of that sort of like, the seamless, that dream of like design to code sort of interface, the ability to do a lot of that more. So I think we're starting to see a number of platforms that are coming in on that space and are getting a little bit more traction and buzz around what that is. So like I said, I think they've done better than most. But I think, that change seems to always happen pretty fast. I remember a friend of mine's a design evangelist at Apple, and he was like, yeah, a year ago, everybody brought me stuff in Sketch, and it's like now everything's in Figma. So I think that's the other challenge, that you can lose that lead real quick.
100%. I remember I was InVision and Sketch's biggest advocate when I first went into leadership. And I think I was about 18 months in to leading the team, and all of my designers kept telling me, Figma, Figma, Figma. He stopped moving over to Figma. And I was extremely resistant because I was so loyal to those tools. And then just literally it got to a point where I just couldn't resist anymore, because the alternative was so compelling and so kind of useful for the industry had person involved.
Yeah.
You know, it was almost kind of a no-brainer. And you're almost kind of
Yeah.
doing your team a disservice to follow and kind of jump on board.
Right. Well, that's why I was joking. Like when I was at InVision, I always said, like, look, if you want to make a difference, I didn't necessarily care about the head of design. I cared about the neck of design because the neck controls the head. And I think, but that's the thing. If there's a better product out there, if it's a more compelling with what it is, I think, like a lot of products are like, oh, well, we have all of our files on there. People won't switch. Yes, they will. And so, but I think, yeah, that's just another one of those leadership stresses is just like, okay, how long do I stick with it? What do I do? Be able to figure that out. Because I think, yeah, Figma completely upended the whole dynamic of like, wait, what do you mean multiple designers can work on this? What do you mean our clients can see what we're doing? Like, it completely shifted the paradigm. And so, but I think for me that like, look, what my biggest advice around this stuff is like, for me, I always approach this like change is the constant. And I think that the companies, the teams, the leaders that are going to be the most successful will adopt the mindset of like agile is the new smart. I don't mean agile is in the methodology, but that day where you're like, oh, I know where the industry is going to be in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months is gone, right? You need to organize yourself and your teams that things are going to change. And that I think the most successful ones are the ones that are prepared to react, not are prepared to try to hold on to the past.
Yeah, and to try something new as well, right? Leveraging the new technologies, such as AI, and I think that could be, I know Figma's already adopting AI into its structures, right? And it's using it in different kind of parts of the tool, but that could be the next shift, right, Stephen? Maybe AI could be, or an AI tool that helps us design in a different way could be the next shift that we move over to.
Yeah, I think like for me, my studio for the last 2 years has been big users of AI, of Midjourney, of Runway, of a lot of things like that. I think, we've seen we can work with our clients very differently. We can be a lot more collaborative. We can create work a lot faster. I think, we are very clear that we are not going in there to let the AI be creative for us, that we are going in there with a purpose and a point, that we still need to communicate things and to do whatever that is. So I think AI can be a great help to what that is. Again, I think, that's a lot of the new skill set. And whenever I teach younger designers, I think you need to figure out how do you collaborate with an AI? How do you collaborate with people who use AIs? Like in the past, I've had neural nets like as a part of design thinking exercises, right? So I think it absolutely is going to change. Again, I think a lot of the executional part of the industry, but again, it's not the first time we've seen that, right? Desktop publishing disrupted so much of the printing industry. The web disrupted. So again, I think, this is a much faster and a different scale of magnitude than what that is. But again, I think, you've got to be able to keep rolling with that. And again, I think, for me, that's what I always try to really focus on is not ever being too precious about my process or my tools or things like that, I don't want to be a sheep and just do it because everybody else does it, but go in and actually try, use, see, understand what I think about it.
Brilliant, Stephen. And look, these are really great points, really great topics we've covered today, Stephen. I wanted to really just know what's next for you and the Crazy Design Studio, right? Because you've been working on some really great stuff with some really great clients. What's next for Stephen and Crazy Design Studio?
So for us, I think I started the studio purposely to be different. We work with a small number of clients. I think just because I've worked for so long, like I've become a little bit anti-scale, that my goal is not to grow it. Honestly, I just want to do cool stuff with cool people. Like we love solving problems. I'm leaning into, for myself and my team, that part of our creative process. So right now we're designing a restaurant and an app and a website and merch for a world tour, right? Like we're leaning into that diversity. We're leaning into working with clients who want to partner with us and trust us and go on that journey and be able to do a lot of those sort of things. I think it's helping us kind of build our faith back in people in the industry, right? So I think, it's been 3 years now. It keeps going like gangbusters and keeps doing that. So I think it's just for us, it's keep having fun, keep learning, keep pushing. Brought the after a 13-month hiatus, brought the podcast back. So again, trying to share more of that, have more conversations like this. Love this show and what you guys are doing. But I think it's more of, again, getting back to that and kind of helping the world remember how good it can be to be different, to be a little crazy.
Scott, I've just got one last question. Sorry.
Sure.
Where do you think design's heading? And like, if you could summarize your vision for the future for designers, what does that look like?
I mean, look, I think design's heading where it's always been heading, right? I think we're the problem solvers. We're the people who see things differently. We're the ones who don't run to the solution. We're the ones who are comfortable being uncomfortable, right? I think that for me, that I think that we're going through an era where I hope more designers find their voices, where we see more design-led startups, where we see more of like we understand what our impact is, that it's not just sort of doing the executional part of what design is. That again, I think people are going to feel like AI is going to be a little bit of a threat to some part of that. I'll continue to joke a little bit for like clients to replace us, they need to be able to clearly express what they want. So we're probably safe for a little bit, right? But look, we're the problem solvers. We're the ones that, because here's where I think design has always been going, right? We're the ones who remind everybody that they are creative, because I believe that everybody is creative, just most everybody forgot. Right? You go into a kindergarten class, you see everybody's a singer, a painter, a superhero, right? We're the people that can remind people of what that is, right? We can remind them that it can be fun and be possibilities and be a kid again, and to be able to kind of see to do something that's different, or to think different, or that taking a risk is worth it, right? That, to overcome that comfort and that sort of quiet desperation to be able to get to do something great. And again, I think that's always what design's gift has been, is to understand the people and the process and a lot of those sort of things to be able to make it happen.
Oh, fantastic. I completely agree with that. And I think going back to kind of fundamentals, being able to be a kid again, or allow people to feel or remember what it's like to be a kid in their creativity is definitely something I want to take away. For our listeners, where can they find you? If they want to kind of get in touch, if they want to follow your work.
Yeah. So I'm pretty easy. Just type my name in anywhere. So I think, for me, the work is under, it's crazydesign.com. You can see the work. If you're looking for somebody to come in and sort of, again, help, mix things up. We always love a good conversation and a good problem. So you can reach out to us there. For the last, 7.5, almost 8 years, I've had the Crazy One podcast. That's on literally every podcast platform, YouTube, and things like that. Again, you can find me on LinkedIn and reach out. I think I do my best to literally get a hold of everybody, and every single week, every Friday, I do 3 free 30-minute mentoring sessions on the Amazing Design People list. So you can jump on there if you want some mentoring or do stuff like that. You can always find me for a free 30-minute talk there. But yeah, just reach out anywhere, and I do my best to get back to everybody as quick as I can.
Awesome. Thanks, Stephen. So, look, it's been really great speaking to you. And I think Jay and I have both, I'm not going to speak for Jay, but I've really enjoyed this discussion, Stephen. And yeah, it's been great having you on the show.
No, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much.
It was a great talk.